And as you also perhaps know back to American history, it was used against successful Jews, quote unquote. It was used in the earlier 20th century by the presidents of the Ivy League schools like Harvard to try to then shut Jews out of admission.
Percentage of Jewish students in Ivy Leagues has been going down over the past decade very significantly until we had the Supreme Court decision that basically said it's not legal to discriminate on race on admissions. And now I just saw in a few of the universities that have taken away their discrimination, the number of Asian students has gone way up and the number of Jewish students has gone way up. So we can surmise that Jews and Asians have been marginalized by these administrators at the Ivy League because of this sort of view of everything through a racial lens instead of looking at the individual student. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we have a very special guest, someone who I've been reading her stuff for a long time and following her, and we'll get into, I think, all the way from 2002 with the Daniel Pearl story, the tragic story. We'll talk about that with regards to her new book. So Asra Nomani is a author, journalist, and the co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement. And so, Asra, it's great to talk to you.
Wonderful to talk to you too, Ariel. It's great to be with you.
Likewise. So let's just delve right into it. You wrote a book which seems a little bit prophetic. It was right before, in the same year of October 7th. I saw just now on Google, it was published in February of 2023. And so the name of the book is Woke Army, the Red-Green Alliance that is destroying America's freedom. And it's just a great title because right after October 7th, we saw this alliance in action. We saw in a larger scale, I think, than probably when you were actually writing your book. You saw it in the open. We saw it on basically every street in the West. You focused more on America, but saw it in Europe, in England, London, millions of people marching every Saturday. There was hundreds of thousands of people every Saturday. So maybe give us a little bit of a retrospect of why you wrote the book before October 7th, because I wasn't thinking about these types of things at the time for sure. And also, what did you find when you wrote it?
Well, thank you so much, Ariel. I love to be prophetic, right? But I hate to be prophetic because,
Exactly.
When you spell out for the world the threat that they face, then you don't want it realized. But just as you mentioned, I published this book on February 14th, actually, 2023. It was my love letter to my enemies. What I have been doing for the last 2 decades since the tragic murder of my friend Daniel Pearl, whom you mentioned, I have been in the trenches of this world trying to investigate this network that not only has Israel in its scopes to destroy, but the Jewish people, America, West, and democracy as we know it. And why do I care? Because I am born in India. I grew up in West Virginia, from where I'm talking to you. My parents were critical thinkers. In a conservative Muslim family, I wasn't allowed to wear a skirt because it would show my legs. I didn't wear nail polish, but my parents allowed me to run track and know my power as a girl. And so that raised in me a feminist spirit. And that is incompatible, as you know too well, with the network of these powerful Muslim organizations that have now become terrorist groups like Hamas. And so it became very personal to me on January 23rd, 2002, when my friend Danny left this home that I was renting in Karachi. And it's become my life's work to investigate.
Can you, just before I just want to stop you, can you just in short to remind us what exactly happened to him and what were you doing with him in Karachi? What was your relation to him?
Yeah, when October 7th happened, everything flooded back inside my system because everything had changed in the 20 plus years, but nothing had changed. On January 23rd, 2002, Danny left this home that I was renting in Karachi, Pakistan. Both of us reporting after the 9/11 attacks on the militant groups that were spread throughout Pakistan and going into Afghanistan, of course. Danny came to visit me because he was investigating the facilitator behind the attack of this young man named Richard Reed, trying to blow up an airplane over the Atlantic. Richard Reed is why we take off our shoes in airports now. And Danny came to visit with his wife, Marianne. She was pregnant with their baby, and they had already picked the name Adam. I was so thrilled. Danny had been my friend for 9 years, and he was my buddy. I just really just felt this thing that I think the whole world absorbed when they saw his smile, which was just his positivity. And so I waved goodbye to Danny on that day, and we never saw him again. He was kidnapped by Muslim militants in Pakistan, and he was then, days later, beheaded in the most brutal of ways. These last few days have been haunting also because, like these young Israeli and the young Israeli American Hirsch Goldberg, Danny his only crime was being Jewish and having Israeli ancestry. And so I know that a lot of people today are awakening to this threat. And I am so heartened that people are coming into awareness about what we're facing. What I hope is that people will take that awareness and manifest it, just as I have tried to do over these last 2 decades to dismantle this network. Yeah. And that's really what brought me to write this book also.
So what did you maybe take us behind the scenes to the process of how do you even go about writing such a book, and where did you first start looking, and maybe then take us to the actual conclusions of what you found?
Yeah, I came back from Karachi, Pakistan in a new incarnation. I had actually gotten pregnant with a boyfriend, and I left Pakistan because it is a crime, as you know, by Islamic law to be unmarried without a wedding ring on your finger and pregnant. I came back here to West Virginia, where we know a little something about single moms. And my parents, these great people that I introduced you to a minute ago, they embraced me. Just across the room here, my dad built a room for my son and me, and I welcomed my baby into this world. And you'll appreciate my son's name. I gave him the name Shibli, which is actually a village not far from Haifa, a Bedouin village, and it means my lion cub. And I gave him the Arabic name of Daniel as his middle name. So Shibli Daniel Nomani. And like the story of Daniel and the lion's den, we all face this dilemma of whether we are going to trust our faith, and our moral compass. And that is what happened to me. I came back to America and I ended up standing up for women's rights in Islam. It became a very accidental journey for me, where I went to our local mosque and met this man at the front door who yelled at me and said, "Sister, take the back door," because he was expressing this very fundamentalist, conservative, orthodox view that women had to be separate from men and also take a separate door. And so from there, I was born this accidental activist. I took my pen to paper and started writing about how this feminist spirit is one that we need to reclaim in Islam, because while things were regressive in the 7th century, Islam did bring some progressive ideas to that area where it was born in Mecca. And so that's where I ended up confronting this entire network. It was just unbelievable to me that in the 21st century, there were people who would argue that, women had half the witness of a man, that the girls deserve less inheritance than a boy, all of these really regressive ideas. And so that's how I ended up face to face with the people that I ended up reporting on and chronicling in the book. And so over these 20 years, I've had these run-ins with these organizations that you are now, just like you said, seeing on the streets. You might not be able to see it, but I've just put up a copy of my book, and it has a hammer and sickle in one corner, and then the star and crescent moon of Islamists. And so that network is what I confronted, and the very first person that I have in this cast of characters that I wrote is a man by the name of Hatem Bazian. It might be a name that people are familiar with now. If you can't remember his name, just remember to say Hatem Bazian, and that's his first name, Hatem Hatem. And he's the one who was the architect of Students for Justice in Palestine. And he created American Muslims for Palestine. And then down a few notches, I've got the Council on American Islamic Relations, another organization that claims that it's for civil rights, but the civil rights end in our Muslim community. They don't extend that far. When I asked them for assistance as a Muslim woman for my civil rights, they said, "Oh, Asra, we don't do Islamic relations. We do American Islamic relations." And what they actually do and how they were actually formed was to destroy the state of Israel. And so that's how I, over these 20 years, developed this list, of these organizations that we now see on the streets. And really what I did is what most journalists, try to do, which is allow the reporting to lead you to the conclusions. And I was able to see firsthand this massive network that is against Israel and the Jewish people.
But just to maybe clarify, when you say the red green alliance, you mentioned the hammer and the sickle, and then the Islamic symbols of these the more Islamic groups. Basically, the main point of the book is, and I read a little bit about what you wrote on Substack, which I think is, I recommend everyone go read it because I found it very compelling. Just you explained the reasons why you wrote the book and what you found along the way. Is that the premise is that there's this alliance between, you call it a network, but basically an alliance between the extreme left, or maybe not, they're not extreme anymore. They're part of the, I guess, mainstream of the progressive left, and the more Islamist organizations, maybe not even, what do you call them? The radical Islamist organizations, or how would you characterize them?
Yeah, in many cases, they're just Islamist sympathizers because they have become, kind of mainstream Muslim organizations by the book. But unfortunately, they pull their punches when it comes to calling out entities like Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood, which is very illiberal, as we know, in their interpretation of Islam.
So let me just ask you, how does this coalition coalesce around an issue? Because it seems to me one of the things that we've talked a lot about on this podcast was that how the woke, so to speak, ideology seems to see the world in oppressor versus oppressed paradigm, so that if Israel is the oppressor, Hamas must be the oppressed, and therefore you'll have Queers for Palestine, which is the more extreme example, but it makes sense if you take this logic to the extreme. So if the queers are oppressed and Hamas is oppressed, then they'll be converged together. But did you find places where, for example, the Islamist organizations obviously do not like the queers? When do these sort of issues come up?
Yeah, so Ariel, just like you're pointing out, this awareness that we've had about this layer of the oppressor versus oppressed, I wasn't aware of this myself as I was doing the bulk of my reporting from 2002 till 2020. I recognized this new phenomenon of intersectionalism that started emerging as a cliche in organizing politics in the progressive left around 2016, when a so-called resistance emerged to Donald Trump's victory in the White House. And so I saw the early imprint of this. And one of the best examples of the point that you're raising is this Palestinian American activist named Linda Sarsour, who is notorious in our Muslim community as, a sympathizer for the Islamist groups. And if anyone doesn't know what that means, it's an Islamist is somebody who believes in political Islam. So Islam in law, in governance. And so why do I, as a Muslim reformer, oppose that? Because it is those laws that drove me from Pakistan. Because it is those laws that say that my baby is illegal and a witness and evidence against my crime of having had sex outside of marriage. And so, any human being with common sense should be opposed to these ideas because they will ultimately infringe upon you as a human being. So there we have, 2016, Linda Sarsour joins this, anti-Trump resistance. And what does she bring with her? But, the quote, brown, black nexus, the race nexus with the women's groups. And she hijacks the Women's March.
Yes.
And if you remember, who was not included on the guest list?
I think the Zionist women.
Yeah, feminists who believe in the state of Israel, which would include somebody like me, because I, as a Muslim, believe in the existence of the state of Israel and recognize it as a legitimate state. I want peace in the Middle East just like everyone else. But, these are realities now. The state of Qatar, I don't like the state of Qatar. I don't like what Saudi Arabia has done in the world, but I recognize their existence, right? And in Israel's case, of course, it is the only liberal front, that we have in that region. But there we have that intersectionalism emerge.
Yes.
So fast forward a few years, and 2020 happens. The George Floyd, killing occurs in May 2020, and I'm a mom in Fairfax County, Virginia. My son is at that point a rising senior in high school, and he is going to a high school named Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. This may seem so far afield from what we're talking about, but I'm going to connect the dots for you. So there, all of a sudden then, Ariel, I learn that the principal of the school tells our families, who happen to be mostly Asian families at this school, that we needed to check our privileges. Because now, all of a sudden, we were resource hoarders because our school had 70% Asian families. And they had been failing Black and Hispanic families. And so I'm just bringing this home to you in how I became aware of this.
1 second. What was the reasoning? Yeah. What was the logic behind what he was saying? Who was failing the Black students, for example? The students that were Asians and successful, basically?
They wanted to blame us. They were basically using us as scapegoats. And they started saying that our children cheated on the entrance exam and, leveled all of these charges. And I'm bringing this example up because this is exactly what has happened to Jews and Israelis. They flip the narrative. Your success as a nation, your success as a people now becomes your crime. And so we became the oppressors. And
yes.
Remember who we are. My family is Muslim. I hit every metric in the oppression matrix. I'm a single mom struggling to make ends meet in expensive Northern Virginia, immigrant, English as second language. My family, my brother has a serious disability, so many layers. And my parents literally survived white supremacy as young children in British colonial India. So I'm just bringing that point because that's the summer I completely rewrote my book then, Ariel. I had a friend who'd gone to Harvard Law School, and he said, Asra, to understand what's going on, just research 3 words: critical race theory. Mm-hmm. And that is this theory that had hijacked our liberal world, our progressive world, our schools. And it is the theory that now puts people in this oppressed and oppressor class. But what is so important to recognize in all of this is that this is a expression and an interpretation, though, of the classic Marxist, Leninist, socialist, paradigm. And that is so important to recognize, because I'm going to show you and your listeners and viewers how it is that is now created this network against Israel, Jews, the West, and America.
But before we do that, let me just ask you a question about, so your son goes to school and the principal tells the children,
Yes.
a senior in high school is like 16, 17. I'm not the equivalent of it. It's a bit different here. So he comes out as a 16-year-old to class, and he's told that he, as a 16-year-old, is basically guilty of, I guess, white supremacy, because and the reason is that he's successful while he's part of a successful group, as I guess being of Asian descent, and the black students, African American students, are less successful in their numbers. So there are black students that are successful, but as a percentage, they're less successful. And therefore, just because he is part of that group, the race group, he's somehow guilty of racism himself.
Exactly.
It's a very just weird thing to say, because you're grouping people by race and then blaming them for basically things that their race is doing.
Right. And I'm sure for yourself and your listeners, this sounds very familiar, because this is exactly the illogical logic that is being used against the people of Israel.
Yes.
And as you also perhaps know, back to American history, it was used against successful Jews, quote unquote. It was used in the earlier 20th century by the presidents of the Ivy League schools like Harvard to try to then shut Jews out of admission into the Ivy League schools.
By the way, Asra, I'll just point out that we spoke with Victor Davis Hanson not too long ago, and one of the things that he says is, and it's not a lie, is that the percentage of Jewish students in Ivy Leagues has been going down over the past decade very significantly, until we had the Supreme Court decision that basically said it's not legal to discriminate on race on admissions. And now I just saw in a few of the universities that have taken away their discrimination after the Supreme Court's ruling, the number of Asian students has gone way up and the number of Jewish students has gone way up. So we can surmise that Jews and Asians have been marginalized by these administrators at the Ivy League because of this sort of view of everything through a racial lens, instead of looking at the individual student.
Right, exactly. I feel a deep connection on this point because, Danny was the son of an immigrant, like my father was, into this country. Dr. Pearl, Judea Pearl, spoke and speaks English as a second language, just like my father.
He's, by the way, being interviewed in our newspaper this weekend, so it's interesting that we're talking.
I'm so glad. My greatest gift from Danny after his murder was the gift of my new friendship with Danny's father. I learned over these 2 decades, where Danny got his wit and his personality, and your audience is going to really benefit from his also wisdom. I'm sure, like a lot of people, people have been moved around the world by Hirsch's parents speaking to both the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee, and some people may not remember Danny Pearl's name, but the reason why we have to stand up with moral courage today is because Hirsch is Danny. Danny is victims from earlier, and the cycle will continue until we, the people, stop it.
So I'm bringing back to track. So I keep on taking you off track because you're saying things that I have stuff to add. But basically, you saw what was happening after George Floyd. You felt it on your skin, so to speak. after
Yes.
your son at
Way of putting it.
school, and then you decided, you said, to rewrite the whole structure of the book and what you're going to do. So maybe just my next question would be, how does this comport with Islam, with the Islamists? So we
Right.
explained how the progressive left is becoming, first of all, more and more radical, and secondly, looking at the whole world through a paradigm of what we just explained, which is sort of like race theory. You mentioned critical race theory, but I think it's even more pernicious. It's like looking at groups and just judging you on the color of your skin. But like one of the things about Asians, they're saying they're white adjacent. It's
Yeah.
like,
Yes.
because you're
Exactly.
successful, you become white adjacent. So looking at groups, and also like a sort of, maybe you can just agree with me that there's a sort of, you love people and groups who are not successful, and you hate groups who are successful. And so there's a sort of incentive for groups to show how poor they are, how
Hmm.
unsuccessful they are, how
Right.
they're being discriminated against, because that gives you social credit with these types of groups. So maybe talk about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I grew up as a child of the 1960s and 70s, classic, um, social justice ideology. I grew up, I became a journalist because I wanted to make the world a better place. I became an activist for Muslim women's rights because I want equality in this world for everyone. And ironically, what I have come to realize, in just deep meditation is, yes, remove the isms, remove whether it's Marxism, socialism, Islamism, even. What it is bigotry, hate,
Yes.
identity politics. And one really important meditation I've had is that we have come to recognize that, like, I'm making a triangle with my hands, that like we do not want or believe in a hierarchy of human value. This is what was the thesis of slavery and colonialism. And what this new movement has done and this network has done is flipped the
Yes.
hierarchy of human value, interjected their own pecking order, and ultimately, though, it is philosophy that's based on a hierarchy of human value that is unacceptable to anybody who has some sense of egalitarianism for how they want
And
this world to
envy,
look.
I think, because what they're saying is that if you're, let's say, part of a group that's marginalized, or a race group, it's all about race, which is, and gender. It's very weird because we're much more than that. I was born to a Hasidic family in Brooklyn, New York. I had the hat, the jacket, the beard, the whole thing. And now I'm like this, and I have a lot of friends from there and friends from here who are totally secular. And I'm from Ashkenazic European descent, Ashkenazic Jew. My wife's parents came from Baghdad and Isfahan in Iran. And so it's not like, you know, I'm the same, she's the same. We should be judged by our character, by the things that we do, by our merits. And instead, we're being forced to judge each other by things that have nothing to do with our actual character. And so if you're
Yeah,
part of a group that's marginalized, uh, which is weird, again, it's a weird thing to say, but let's say you're an African American you're growing up in the ghetto in Chicago, and it's tough to grow up. We're a little off track, but I'm just thinking about it. And you keep on hearing since you're a child that it's not your fault, that the system is out to get you, that you have no chance because of white supremacy. America's a white supremacist, inherently racist country. And so then what is your incentive to even try? Because you're being told from like zero that no amount of trying will work because you're living in an inherently racist place, and the boot of the system is on your throat. And if I remember correctly, you mentioned George Floyd. One of the things that after George Floyd was they kept on showing that the cop who killed him, I forgot his, Chauvin, was on the George Floyd's neck. And they were showing these memes where the cop is on every African American's neck. And so what if you're an African American, or if you're an, I don't know, Hispanic American, you're thinking, if you're if you believe this propaganda, that maybe you don't have a shot.
Yeah, and I really, really appreciate, your all narrative, your own personal story, Ariel, because I think what you illustrate and with sharing all of your evolution is that we do evolve as human beings,
Yes.
And you are illustrative of that. You are also illustrate in your own life, how a person can't be judged by their skin color, that, sometimes some of us have disabilities too that are invisible to others, or we carry wounds that we are processing. But the one thing that I definitely clicked with in understanding this dynamic that you've been talking about is a term that I write about it in the book, and it's a term that this former FBI agent Joe Navarro coined, and it is about how some people are wound collectors. They have no statute of limitations on their grievances. And some of those people end up becoming terrorist groups and militant groups because it is just like the Nakba and the 1948 and the, propaganda of all of the old wounds being resurrected for today's new call for violence. We know as human beings, I know this as a mother, if I was to raise my son with that psychology, he would be a very stunted human being in adulthood. He would not have a strong sense of self. And these are positive developments that we need to have to grow well into adult life. And these organizations, this is what is so important. These organizations, through their propaganda, like some of the examples that you mentioned, they foment that sense of being a wound collector. And this is their propaganda. And you can see it in all of the Hamas propaganda and all of the propaganda of this woke army that I've chronicled. Over and over again, the terms they use, like this hijacking of the concept of genocide and Nazism and settler colonialism, these are all terms in order to try to emphasize the status of the aggrieved as wound collectors forever.
Asra, we mentioned the woke left, let's say, and we sort of touched on the Islamic part of it. Maybe just explain to us in terms of how because the Islamists don't believe this crazy stuff.
Yes.
In terms of at least that's what it seems to me, because when you're watching these protests in Colombia now, they're coming back to school, so they're going back to protest. So you see the protesters are basically two groups. You have the Islamist organizations, student organizations, and you have the wokeist, leftist, socialist of America, communist of America, all these woke groups of usually white, middle to upper class, because it costs a lot of money to go to these big schools.
Yes.
So they have a lot of money. Their parents have a lot of money. They send them to school. They become crazy people, which is a sad state of American universities, but that's besides the point. And then you have the Islamic students. And so my question is, how do the Islamist organizations, the Islamist leaders, what kind of language do they use in order to co-opt this woke agenda? So maybe explain to us, so Islamists obviously don't believe in, for example, we mentioned Queers for Palestine, but that's a crazy example. But how about I don't know, like racism and all this kind of stuff? It's something that, you go to an Islamic country, Saudi Arabia, you mentioned, or Qatar, you have a lot of racism against, minorities. And so they don't really care about that, but they use it. So maybe explain to us.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I think it is very much the point that that we need to worry about on what happens to the psychology of the young students that are fed all of this propaganda, because their growth is stunted, in the name of being one of the, champions for the oppressed. And that's what really worries me as a parent also, and as somebody who cares about our future leaders, is that we are stunting the growth of young people. and in ideas that are gonna fail. Like these are ideas that they are pushing to destroy capitalism as we know it, while they are getting subscriptions to the Revolutionary Communist Party through Venmo. So it's just comical. So I'm going to show you some examples. I brought some out. So what happened is a couple weeks ago, I went to the streets of Chicago to be the eyes and ears of you and your listeners. And I investigated the 200 plus organizations that had come together to create the March on the DNC. So we think that they have hijacked the Democratic Party, but now they're marching on the DNC. I wanted to make sense of that. And so I'm going to answer your question with some examples. So this is the Islamists. Okay. These are illustrations of the Islamists. So I'm reaching behind me and I'm pulling up some of their posters. This is from the American Muslims for Palestine. You always have to look at the small print on the signs. And I feel like I do a service for humanity because I go around after these protests and pick up their trash because they sure leave it there in the park. And what they have is shut the DNC down. So if you remember, they wanted to speak at the DNC while they burn it down. And they have images of Democratic leaders like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. And what they do is they continue to put this propaganda, in that case, against Joe Biden, putting laser beams for eyes, Kamala Harris, Anthony Blinken. And this is one of the words that they use to hijack the left. The genocide of Palestinians. So they're speaking to people's guilt, right? And their conscience.
Yeah.
I just want you to know, too, that this is the complexity of what's happening in the U.S. These are the names that these people have now coined for the leaders. Joe Biden became Genocide Joe. Kamala Harris became Killer Kamala. Anthony Blinken became Baby Killer Blinken. And they hijack these terms. So here's another sign I'm going to show you. And it says, it's by the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. And this organization is one of the ones that's organized the protests around the country. This sign says, end U.S. aid to Israel. So they're trying to appeal to logic there, okay? Which is like, stop the money. And then what do they do? This is, again, speaking to your question about what do they appeal to on the left? Money for schools. Who's going to oppose that, right? Jobs, healthcare, and housing, not genocide. So what have they done is created this false binary, right, between Israel, the genocide state, so-called genocide state, and everything that we want to give the young kids and the elderly. And what they include then are just in the background, again, subtlety, right, is the image of just ordinary Americans. So that's the Islamists. And then I'm going to go to how they brand for the middle of the road, okay? So this is without going far left. They have a sign that they carried called immigrant rights and legalization for all. So they go to immigrant rights. They go to, they align with a group called Chicago Alliance, okay, against racist and political repression. Who's going to have, so they appeal to those high ideas. And what do they say in this sign? From Chicago to Palestine. Mm-hmm. And this is the theme that has hijacked America from Ferguson to Gaza. From, if you can believe it, I'm going to show you a sign that takes us now. I'm going to take you into the organizations. So there are about 250 organizations. About 50 of them are self-proclaimed, self-identified socialist, Marxist, Leninist organizations and communist. So they're not even just left or progressive. They are
they're also anti-religious. So a lot of these people. Yeah.
Yes. So important a point. And again, a contradiction, right, with our Islamists. But to close the loop on this network, this is one sign that I'm lifting that says the Workers' World Party. So there's no subtlety. This is the Communist Party. Zionism is genocide. So now they're making that false equivalency, just like they might say that Asians are white adjacent. And now this is part of their global. This is one of my favorite signs. This is from Palestine to Philippines, because this is a global network. And what I'm going to do is in this index that I've created of a database, I'm going to make this global, because what I saw were 3 Filipino American groups that want to bring communism to the Philippines. And they want to get rid of the US military there. And so another group is very obvious. And in the fine print, they say Freedom Road Socialist Organization. So they're not subtle, And this is why the hammer and sickle is such an important element of this discussion, because I can tell you now in my initial research of 1,000+ organizations that are putting students now in protest camps and encampments and all that. Of those 1,000 organizations, a good chunk of them are part of that socialist, communist, Marxist-Leninist, self-described organizations. And so this is not just a war on Jews and Israel, but it's a war on the West, war on democracy. And the last element that I want to introduce people to is one that I know people are familiar with, but the idea of foreign influence. Because in these organizations, we either see direct support from governments overseas, aligned interests like support for the socialist organizations in the Philippines, Cuba, and Africa. And then what we also see is malign foreign influence. Like that's a term that intelligence and law enforcement use to describe election interference by governments like Russia or China or Iran. And so malign is really important to me as a term, because I'm obviously foreign influence in the US. I'm an immigrant kid here. I hope to think that I'm positive influence in the US and for our world. But it's this malign influence that we all, I think, are connected in trying to oppose. And that malign foreign influence is what is trying to also destroy the state of Israel. And understanding it in its entirety, to me, is so important to also help alleviate anxiety that people naturally will have about this network. Because as it is, you see, a protest here at UCLA and then at Columbia, and you don't necessarily recognize that there's a coordinated...
Everything's connected.
Yeah, exactly. And they also have their digital toolkits, so it's like, it's been necessary for me to report on this also, because I think a lot of people can understand that, like, in the face of tragedy, like I felt after Danny's murder, I just had to understand it. Like a part of coping with trauma sometimes, I think, is also being able to understand it. And I had to come to a realization that, like, none of my answers were ever going to bring Danny back. Like I went all the way, Ariel, to the depths of Guantanamo Bay to witness the trial of the 9/11 detainees. And I realized on that trip, like, I'm not going to be able to bring Danny back. But
wasn't by the way, his killer, his murderer, isn't he still in Guantanamo? And that not too long ago was reported that they signed a plea deal with him where he wouldn't get the death penalty, and then they right away went back on it because there was an outcry about it. That was his actual beheader. Is right. The U.S. government and the Biden administration almost cut a deal with to reprieve him from the death penalty. I don't understand why he wasn't given death penalty yet. He's there for like 20+ years. Doesn't make any sense. But besides that,
no, it's really important, because this is also really relevant to the challenge that Israel and Jewish community face today. Because how are we going to have accountability? How are we ever going to have truth and reconciliation, on these very painful experiences and this war that has unleashed now, I thought of it again because, as you know, the U.S. Justice Department just put, Hamas leaders on their list of most
They want to
wanted.
put them on trial. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they wanted to put Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's the man that you're talking about, on trial also. But unfortunately, he went into military trial. And in military trial, they've actually been given more protections than I think they would have gotten in criminal court. You could have probably gotten him given him a life sentence, if not a death sentence for financing terrorism or something smaller than, a crime of killing the thousands that he killed. But unfortunately, then it got complicated because of the interrogations and all of the other military dynamics. But like you said, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the man who took credit for killing Danny with his blessed right hand, he said. And we have to remember that moment because, as I mentioned before, everything's changed, but nothing's changed because now that blessed right hand of the terrorist is being used to slay more innocent.
Okay, yeah, I agree. It's hard. It's horrible to even talk about it, but and I think because we keep on forgetting, and then something happens to remind us every time. So I want to ask you one more thing about this topic, which is I spoke not so long ago with Ayan Khirsi Ali on our podcast, and one of the things that I asked her, she's very worried about this woke thing, and especially I think we even mentioned your book and your work during our conversation, and one of the things that she said, which I found very, I think, illuminating, is that a lot of these woke progressives who are on the marches, supporting candidates in the West, in England, we saw 5 candidates who were elected because of their Gaza stance to parliament. And all these other things is that they do not have their basic proposal is to destroy the current Western institutions. That is the basic of all these protesters who are on the left. But they don't have really a plan what will come after they destroy everything. So they don't, maybe some of the organizations do, but the actual people on the ground, I assume if you spoke to them at the protests at Chicago, they have no idea what they're doing. They have no idea what will come instead of the racist country that they live in now, quote unquote. But the Islamists do have a plan, she said. And so I think that is the danger here. When you look at these organizations, do you see this red-green alliance where the Reds, do they understand that at the end game, the Islamists have a much different plan than they do?
Yeah, I'm really glad you spoke to Ayan. She's been a champion of clarity on this fight that we're in. I have testified beside her in Congress and been ignored beside her by the Democratic leaders, including Kamala Harris. And she makes a really important point that we have seen in history, which is that the socialists aligned with the Islamists to overthrow Shah of Iran in 1979. And they were the first ones to be executed by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And so I had this question for all of those that were protesting in Chicago. It was at a place called Union Park on the west side of Chicago, lovely little park about the size of 10 U.S. football fields. And I went table by table. And this was, one of the booklets that I got. It's how Marxists use bourgeois elections. And I Venmoed these guys $5, the revolutionary communists of America. They do have a playbook. They have a very clear playbook that they have from history, and they cite Marx and Lenin and Mao Zedong in China. In my interviews with the foot soldiers in this effort, they want to see socialism, communism, Marxism, and Leninism. And I just use all of the terms because
the isms.
They each one has a different variation on it. But even, a child would understand that they're all about the same. And that's the overthrow of the United States as we know it. This is a sheet that I'm showing right now. And it says Claudia 2024, Karina 2024 for president and vice president. They are the ticket on the ballot in 2024 for an organization called the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And nowhere on the flyer that I'm showing does it say Party for Socialism and Liberation, except in really fine print down at the bottom in a circle that's really hard to read. But what it does say really clearly, their URL is votesocialist2024.com.
They couldn't take it off the website.
Yeah. So Ariane is completely correct that the Islamists have a very clear playbook, and this is the Islamic State. We have seen models of it. They want to recreate the Ottoman Empire that they lost in the 90s. That is their wound, Then came the so-called Nakba, and every war that the Arabs armies fought afterwards to destroy Israel. But the far left, that includes these very well-established organizations of socialism and communism, have their own playbook. And it's not much unlike people who believe in end times, who end up aligned with each other, and they just, because of faith, believe, well, my end time revelation's the one's going to prevail at the end, not yours. But we're going to keep fighting our common enemy till that time comes. The deep meditation that we all have to have, of course, is that what is that final resolution going to look like? In each of these instances,
it's not a good one.
Yeah, it's a new hierarchy of human value. It's a new tyranny of the soul and the spirit. And that's why whatever we call ourselves in religion or race or gender, we have to stand up for humanity.
I have a few other subjects that I want to talk to you about. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about it, is that the Muslim community in the US seems to me is a bit different than the one in other Western countries, like in Europe, in the sense that maybe other than places like Dearborn, Michigan, or where Ilhan Omar is from in Minnesota or something, it seems I grew up in Brooklyn. We had a large Muslim community next to where I grew up in. So there seems to be a lot less, maybe I'm totally wrong, a lot less pervasiveness of radicalism than there is in Europe. I don't know exactly, maybe I'm totally wrong to explain, maybe. But one of the things that in general I don't understand is that Muslim people coming from the Middle East to different countries all in the West, they're leaving failed states and failed societies to come to the West, where they'll have more opportunities financially, culturally, educationally for their children. And then a lot of them, or I don't know if a significant amount of them decide that they want to keep their same worldview that they had in the failed society. This is a different subject than what we've been talking about until now, but how do you explain this phenomenon where you're running away from a place that is totally bad because you're running away from it, and yet you're keeping a lot of the values that made it so bad?
Yeah. For the book, I go to a place called 500 Grove Street in Herndon, Virginia. And that is where many of those immigrants from our Muslim communities arrived in the 1980s to build an empire. And that is the empire that funds and foments a lot of the Islamist organizations in the U.S. They have been investigated by the FBI. They have been raided by the FBI. And 5 people have gone to jail from this organization called Holy Land Trust. And yes, some of your listeners, you might be familiar with it. Well, this network behind me with all these signs, they want to free those guys, by the way. But what exactly to your point, those folks arrived, like my dad, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Like me, I now have a first generation born into the United States. They do also. They have property. They bought land. They called it, they named their streets Safa and Marwa for the 2 hills between which Hagar, or Hajar as we call her in Islam, ran after Abraham kicked her out into the desert.
With her son.
And with her son Ishmael.
Ishmael.
And and so we have Safa Court and Marwa Court. We have these organizations funded, if you can believe this, Ariel, this is so comical, by a halal chicken factory down in the South. And so they've used our capitalism, they've used our freedoms in order to become bigger and better and supersize themselves. But what they're trying to create, I believe, in talking to them, watching their videos, and reading their literature, is a society that is not the ones that they left, because they consider those nations, like run by, the royalty in Jordan, Saudi, UAE, the so-called royalty, fake royalty, in Qatar, all those places. Those are not the models that they want to create. They want Islamist nations. Those are theocracies and monarchies, as we know. They are not the Muslim Islamic state that these individuals want.
Are there any actual Islamic states around right now, or is it like communism, where you say it wasn't any real communism, so you can't say it's bad because it was never tried?
Well, unfortunately, Afghanistan has returned to becoming an Islamic state. Iran is an Islamic state, so that's why we see Iran also supporting these groups across sectarian lines from Shia to Sunni, because ultimately, and that's why we see that alliance of Hamas and Hezbollah, though they're Sunni and Shia, because they believe in a overriding Islamic state. At the end, they want their Shia sacked or their Sunni sacked, just like end times battles. They want their vision to ultimately prevail, but to get there, they'll work together. And I know them, like they're my neighbors. They are in Northern Virginia, and they've gotten on the school board. That's how I ended up becoming a mama bear activist. And after this battle in 2020, tried to call all Asian families, oppressors. And that is how they are also penetrating American society, from the library board to the school board to the city council. They try to claim that they're just following in the footsteps of the ways that the Jewish community has asserted power. But one critical difference is that they want to destroy the West as we know it. They do not want equal women's rights or LGBTQ rights. You had said earlier, you had asked about where the dividing line is. Where are the fault lines? And I stood at the street corner in Montgomery County, Maryland last summer. And there I saw the woke army dismantling for a moment. And that was because the far left was supporting the books that are now in our school systems that encourage children to question their gender and sexual identities from as early as 4 years old. And the Muslim families were not going to have any of that, right? So it was fascinating. It was so fascinating to watch them literally face off now against each other.
Had, by the way, in Dearborn, in a few places in Michigan, where there was, before the Israeli-Gaza conflict, so it was more the culture wars in America, where you saw that Muslims came to the city hall, to Muslim residents, to basically say, we don't want these books, we don't want this gender theory taught to our children. And then on the other side, you had the leftists who were saying, no, we want everybody from the age of 4 to be taught they could be a girl, they could be a boy, etc. And then the Israeli conflict is happening. Right. And I'm thinking at some point it's going to start over. It's going to boil over, and then they'll start fighting with each other. So maybe in that we should take solace that it can't hold forever, because the Muslim students do not want to teach the Muslim people do not want to teach their kids this kind of garbage. And the woke people, not only do they want to teach it, they want to force it on everyone else. And so it's going to stir up at some point.
Yes, exactly. And, interestingly, you'll be really intrigued by this. That happened through last year. And now in the battle on the issue of Israel, I interviewed all the socialist, communist, foot soldiers that I could find, and I wanted to ask them explicitly, what is your end all solution then for this problem? I wanted to pin people down whether they are now defaulting to a quote one state solution with the state being Palestine. And interestingly, there is a wedge in that question because a lot of the socialist, communist, Marxist, Leninist individuals that I spoke with said they can accept the state of Israel because they see it as a potential socialist state, right? And
Started off
obviously,
as one.
the kibbutz, right? The kibbutz and the foundation of the nation did begin that way, exactly like you said. And so this is the place to press, I believe, because the Islamist vision of even the human being is about divides like gender, right? And like men are superior to women. And obviously there's sexism in the socialist world, but there's this class, right? And Hamas leaders fail in the class struggle because they're millionaires, right? The royalty of Qatar fail in the class struggle because they are bazillionaires. And so this is, I believe, fault lines that can potentially be exploited and used to not, just in psychological warfare, but actual logic, because the values that the Islamists are fighting to win over in this world are so valueless, right? And with any close examination, you can see that that they contradict most human values. And so that's where I think we have to keep pressing. But unfortunately, right now, this network of the communist, socialist, leftists, they see opportunity in the Israel issue, that they push their membership among the young people. I see everywhere I go, I see them hawking their T-shirts and their stickers and their memberships. Yeah, and it's membership, and ultimately, I showed you guys this flyer of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. They would like to win the White House. Like, they're not going to win the White House, but they want to become a political party threat in the United States.
But I would just say that they don't even need to win the White House. The fact is that we were told, it wasn't even a secret. It was reported in a number of places, I think also the New York Times, that Kamala Harris met with the members of the Uncommitted movement, which was the movement that, because of the Gaza war, refused to vote for Biden in the primaries and voted uncommitted. And she basically made it understood to them that she would be open to a weapons embargo on Israel. So then she said that she wasn't. But the fact that, first of all, you would meet with such people is very, very disconcerting, and shows that, at least on the left flank of the Democrat Party itself, there's a very big openness to talk with this group, with this flank of their left wing. So let's say Donald Trump met at the time with Kanye and the other Nazi, and I forgot his name. It doesn't matter. And then everybody, and everybody said everybody was saying how bad it was, and he distanced himself right away. He said, whether you agree with Trump or not, that's not the point. The point is that the center of the party, the establishment, knew that it was problematic and forced him, or even he understood that he needed to distance himself. And when the Democrats have members in Congress who are stereotyping Jews, and then the candidate for president meets with open anti-Semites, and the vice president meets with the mayor of Dearborn, who celebrated October 7th and is quoted numerous times praising Ilhan Omar from his state, it's very, very disconcerting. But we don't have a lot of time left, so I don't want to keep you too long, but I want to ask you two more questions. Number one is, just as if you had to ballpark it, so it's a more of a shorter answer. how much of the Muslim community in the U.S. would you say is on the extremes that we talked about? And approximately, would you say that it would be a third of the Muslims, more or less, in America? Or is it really a minority of a minority that are on the extremes that we described until now?
Yeah, I think those that are Islamists or Islamist sympathizers is probably around 10%. But the problem is that there's about, and then there's about 10% that I am a part of, which is vocally
Yes.
against the Islamists, vocally. But the problem is that in the middle of this 80% that just don't speak up,
Why? Because they're
and
scared. They don't want trouble.
yeah, a couple of things. When I spoke up, they came after my family, right? They came after me. I got my first death threat ever, death to Asra. And they're so clever. The email came over as DTA. I was like, okay. So now I'm an acronym, death to Asra. They try to shame. They try to intimidate. They try to do everything that Israelis and Jews are feeling right now. They called me an Islamophobe. Character assassination is a tactic of their war. What do many of these immigrant families want? Marriage proposals for their children, recommendations to medical school or graduate school for their children. So that is part of the problem that I've seen, firsthand. I can name about 20 Muslims in the US and Canada who are outspoken, against the Islamists and Hamas.
Out of 3 million, more or less, I think.
Yeah.
In America,
yeah.
at least. I don't know about Canada. But in
Yeah.
America, I think it says 3 million Muslims in America.
Yeah. And so my greater vision on this earth is, of course, to win the middle and empower them, but we have to defeat the extreme, and that because they carry such a weapon over the minds of the majority. And I still hold the majority responsible because they are the ones then that accept the sexism and the misogyny and, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish sentiments.
Anti-American, I think. Anti-West.
Anti-American. Yeah. Exactly.
Asra, one last thing before we, maybe a thing and a half. So what I wanted to ask is that I've been on Twitter over on X last few days, and it's a mistake that I shouldn't be doing because it's bad for your soul, but I'm guilty of doing it. And one of the things that I don't know about you, but we've been seeing is a rise, at least in the visibility of right-wing anti-Semitism. So we've seen people like Candace Owens gaining extreme traction for spreading really the most vile things about Jews, about the Holocaust. Holocaust denialism is very rampant on Twitter. Also, you mentioned Fuentes. He's popular among a certain segment of the population. Andrew Tate, we all know besides the misogyny and all that, he's very anti-Semitic or anti-Israeli, whatever. And my question is, we spoke about the progressive side of the paradigm, but do you see a danger on the right in terms of this creeping up sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. And, what I'm heartened by is that the media will be quick to call out the
Yes.
right, in their anti-Semitism. So that is the, equal opportunity coverage that I wish that they would also do for the left. And that's why I think you and I spend so much time discussing
Yes, exactly.
the left, because that is overlooked in our mainstream media coverage. One of the points that I made in documenting my findings on the protests in Chicago is how media coverage just spoke about those protesters as pro-Palestinian. When fortunately they do correctly call out the far right anti-Semitism, and that's what we need to do and we must do. And you and I are both targets of it because I came up against them my school board and school fights because they didn't like us Asians either. They don't like the Muslims either. And they And so I came into in their crosshairs. They didn't like me either because I was a single mom, so there's just all this intolerance and just, bigotry that they've got, that I'm heartened that we've got an entire network from the Southern Poverty Law Center, to CNN exposing that, which is really good. I mean, we have to do that. And I always say to my friends that are in the Republican parties, both local and national, that they must also differentiate, from those extremists, just like all of us must in our communities, if we're going to all
And I
survive.
think another call it difference between the two sides is that, like we said before, the core of the right, at least of the Republican Party, is that if someone would say something racist, like in the national level, there's obviously crazy people in the local stuff you'll have always. But when there was, I forgot the name of the congressman a few years ago, he said something that was patently racist. They primaried him and he lost. When Donald Trump, we mentioned, met with these people, he was roundly condemned and distanced himself. And also we see we had the two conventions now when Joe Biden, the president of the United States, even though I'm not exactly sure how he's still president, he's on the beach all the time, but when he was president, he gave a speech at the convention and he said that the protesters outside had a point. I don't think you would hear that at any of the Republican National Convention now, even with all the anti-Semitic stuff that we said. And it would be everybody would be talking about it. No one really mentioned that Biden said that. It was like a thing. It happened. And if it would happen at the Republicans, everybody, racist, which is true. But at the other side, it doesn't happen. So I think that is another issue. And also another thing that we could mention, that when Ilhan Omar wrote her thing about the Benjamins, about the Jews, right, the Congress, which was controlled by Pelosi, the Democrat leader, was pressured into putting a condemnation on the floor of the House. And they refused to put the word anti-Semitism into the condemnation. They instead put something generally about hate and about racism and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that shows a lot about their fear of their left flank, about being too much against anti-Semitism, of being too much against. It's very, they're playing a fine dance where on the one hand, Kamala Harris will say, I support Israel. And then the second thing will be, but I'm against anti-Semitism, but I'm also against Islamophobia. And it'll always come together. It's never, I'm against, anti-Semitism. Obviously, we're against Islamophobia, but it's always together in order to sort of balance the two competing factions of the party. So I think that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, definitely. And what I've been a lifelong Democrat since I was a child, because I grew up, as a feminist and social justice warrior. I was what you would call West Virginia Democrat. So Joe Manchin as a senator would be an example of now becoming an independent. But what I saw is exactly what you chronicled here, exactly that. I was in the halls of Congress with documenting the Council on American Islamic Relations, getting Nancy Pelosi to change the resolution that was passed, related to Ilhan Omar's comments. Like that pressure that they put has hijacked the Democratic Party and alienated somebody like myself. But what I witnessed and some of the signs that I showed you from the streets of Chicago, what I have chronicled is that they're going to come for you.
Yes.
No matter who you are. And the Democratic Party and Democratic leaders would be wise to stop their unholy alliance with these organizations and return back to a place where, in America at least, we have two parties that are different in policies, but united in an acceptance of the state of Israel, the vision of America as a secular democracy, and the fundamental right of all human beings to be equal on this earth. let's return to that place where we don't have to worry about the existential future of our nations. This is just one last sign I'm going to share, and this is from an organization called literally Abandon Harris 24. This is the Islamists who are trying to put pressure on the Democratic Party.
And it's working.
And there's this term called bird dogging, where you go harass people in public and follow them around. They're going to bird dog Kamala Harris. That's their plan, to name and shame her till, she comes around on condemning Israel. But they're not going to ever be satisfied, because their end goal is the destruction of the United States as we know it, and the destruction of Israel. And so this is a dangerous game that the Democratic Party has been playing. And I recommend that they pull out of this game, fight for America, and let's have a fair election that elects into office somebody who believes in this nation and its secular governance as we've had it, as our Western democracy as we know it, and friendship with the state of Israel also, and the Jewish people. And that's ultimately how I think we can, all of us, no matter what letter you put next to your name in political affinity, that is how all of us can win on all sides.
Asra, just lastly, before we finish, like you mentioned, we're right before an election. We're recording this about a week before the debate, the first debate between the two candidates. You, if I remember correctly, in 2016 said you voted for Trump. I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly. And so my question is, given all that we spoke about today and this unholy alliance, a lot of people are very worried on the one hand about what we spoke about, and on the other hand, they still are very, very, I would say, I have friends and family like this, are very worried about Trump's personality. So
Right.
There'll be, yes, the unholy alliance between the left and the crazies, which we chronicled here the whole hour, about an hour that we're talking about, is very worrisome. But Trump as a person is very, very scary to me. How do you see these two paradigms, just to finish off the conversation?
Yeah, I twice voted for former President Barack Obama and Joe Biden, because I believed in that culture shift that they were offering America, with hope and belief. Ultimately then turned against the Democratic Party in my vote in 2016, because I saw during those 8 years the hijacking of the Democratic Party by these Islamists that I was studying. I knew them really closely and warned people that what we face today is exactly what we were going to see. I knew I didn't cover Donald Trump when I was at the Wall Street Journal, but covered his best friends, Carl Icahn and other, quote, vulture capitalists, as they're known. They're not nice guys. They, to your point, to put it nicely and delicately, perhaps, have really, unhinged personalities oftentimes that are very off-putting. Can't tell you how many holidays they ruin when we're as journalists, because they always want to do everything on the eve of a holiday, because then they can mess up everybody else's lives. Yeah. And unfortunately, after Trump's near-death moment, he didn't have that transformative effect that I think many people had hoped he would have, of a more
mellowing out.
A wise person, who's just escaped death. I understand his frustrations because he has an entire machine against him, but he has to appreciate that they have a machine against his opponent also, like where there's lawfare against him, there's lawfare for him. There's everything is being waged. And unfortunately, this does put a lot of people in the middle in a quandary. You didn't speak this precisely, Ariel, but in terms of who's going to win this election, it's going to be a result of the middle of America. And that middle of America is turned off by Trump's personality and then turned off by the identity politics that Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party have unleashed on America. And so Kamala is clearly attempting to message more to the middle. Whether she'll be convincing about it is going to be critical on whether she wins that middle's vote. And Trump, is going to have to figure out how to not scare, the life out of that middle.
Suburban women,
their vote. Yeah. Suburban women, but, regular folks. Like, I'm here talking to you from West Virginia. It's a mostly conservative state, mostly Republican, but they're just regular folks. And I see their clear support for Trump. And what they do in many of their instances, talking to them, is overlook those personality issues that are really damaging, but not everyone will. And that's going to define the victories in these swing states like Pennsylvania and Georgia.
It seems like what you're saying is that he turns people off by his personality, but his deeds as president pretty much were, if I'm looking at his, just in my, the economy seemed to be better. The world wasn't basically on fire. So, and I think that's what he's trying to say is, like, I remember yesterday he spoke somewhere and he said, you might not like me, but think about your grocery bill when I was president. And so she is trying to do the opposite, saying, distance herself from President Biden and say, look at him, he's so mean and he's saying all these things. And like you said, now changing a lot of her positions to be more to the middle. But you mentioned that when you met her in the Senate, she refused to even mention you and Ayan and all these things. So I think we do have a sort of very weird dynamic where one candidate is distancing herself from the position that she's in right now. She's the vice president as we speak. And the other candidate is trying to distance himself from the way he presents himself and to push himself towards the actual deeds that he did as president. That's just the way I see it. And the question is whether people will, what they'll think is more important and what's less off-putting. But we'll see. I have to say that the conversation with you, I wanted to even talk to you about, maybe we'll do another one about feminism and where we are with all these gender stuff and also feminism and religiosity. You mentioned in the past that you're an Islamic feminist. And so what exactly does that mean? But we don't have time. So we'll do it a different time. But I have to say that it was illuminating to talk to you. And I appreciate you for your time, Asra. And hopefully we'll meet again.
Yes, in Israel, I hope. I want to definitely continue my journey again back to.
You're welcome. Come.
That land. Yeah, my name, you might not know it, Asra, is a verb in the Quran, and it means to journey. And it's a mystical journey that the Prophet Muhammad made allegorically, of course, from Mecca to Jerusalem on a winged horse that I call the Pegasus of Islam. When I went to Jerusalem last, I found the iron ring that the horse had supposedly been tied to right outside Al-Aqsa Mosque. And, I feel the breath, of history, as you must, when I walk that land. And I also visited the Sarsour building outside of the old city. I went to the Sabaro, where a young girl whose father I met was murdered. I went to Haim Pearl Street, named for Danny's ancestor in the city of Bnei Brak. And you'll appreciate this, Ariel. I kind of didn't read the memo about it closing, on Friday night. And so I ended up going with the exit ramp closed off, but I returned the next night.
Maybe we'll just say that to explain to the viewers who don't know Israel that it's an ultra-Orthodox city, so they close all the streets. They blockade them on Friday all the way to Saturday night.
Yeah, and then that Saturday night, I had a really great walk. The family's out. It was lovely. On that trip, I tried to get an Airbnb in Gaza that I booked, but I didn't get the pass to go across that time. But traveled through Nablus and Hebron, and I wish peace, as everybody does. And in all of this that we have talked about, these are our efforts as humble human beings to try to make sense of it. But ultimately, as you know, like, we're not going to be able to depend on the leaders of our countries, to bring us that peace. And we're going to have to keep doing what we do and what you do, having these conversations, and what I do, investigating, and let's just keep talking and coming together.
Thank you so
Appreciate
much,
it.
Asra.
Appreciate it.